Nestled in the weathered folds of the Appalachian Mountains stood a forgotten cabin, its wooden bones sagging under decades of neglect. To most, it was an eyesore on an otherwise picturesque landscape. To Jacob Miller, a wealthy real estate developer, it was merely an insignificant plot on his vast holdings. But to Eli Thompson, a 20-year-old with calloused hands and determined eyes, it represented something else entirely. Possibly $5 a month, Miller had said dismissively, pocketing Eli's hard-earned cash, without bothering to count it. Though why anyone would want that pile of sticks is beyond me. What secrets might those weathered timbers hold? What would drive a young man with so little to pour his heart into something so broken? The leather journal lay open on Eli's makeshift table, its pages worn soft at the edges from constant handling. Filled with neat handwriting, practical sketches, and pressed wildflowers, it was both a record of dreams and a blueprint for survival. Eli ran his calloused finger over a drawing of the cabin's southern exposure, calculating where the winter sun would fall. Eli Thompson had grown up the third of 6 children in a small house tucked into the valley's protective embrace. His father, Daniel, had worked the mines until black lung had gradually stolen his breath, and at 45 his life. What Daniel Thompson lacked in formal education, he made up for in practical wisdom. The land speaks, he would tell young Eli during their weekend wanderings. Most folks just forgot how to listen. His mother, Sarah, stretched every dollar until it cried for mercy. After Daniel's passing, she took in mending and laundry, her fingers growing gnarled, but her spirit remaining unbroken. The Thompson dinner table never offered abundance, but no one went hungry, even if it meant Sarah claiming she'd already eaten when portions ran scarce. Books had been Eli's window to knowledge. The county's traveling library came monthly, and Miss Peterson always saved the practical volumes: carpentry, gardening, animal husbandry. Knowing Eli's preferences, by 16 he'd built a chicken coop that doubled the family's egg production, designed a rainwater collection system, and grafted wild apple trees to produce sweeter fruit. School had ended for Eli at 17, not from lack of aptitude, but from necessity. With his older brothers moved away, one to the army, one to the shipyards, the burden of helping support the family fell to him. He found work wherever it existed, assisting the local veterinarian, splitting firewood for elderly neighbors, picking up shifts at Miller's lumber yard, where the owner's son, Jacob, occasionally appeared in pressed shirts to survey his inheritance. "You're different from the others," old Doc Wilson had told him once, watching Eli methodically organize medications in the veterinary clinic. "Got both feet on the ground, but your eyes see more than what's in front of you." For 3 years, Eli contributed most of his earnings to the family coffers, tucking away small amounts in the battered tin box beneath his bed. Each coin represented a step toward independence. Not to escape family responsibility, but to create something that might sustain them all. The idea had come during a spring delivery of lumber to one of Miller's remote properties. From the truck, Eli had spotted the abandoned cabin, half hidden by overgrown rhododendron. Something about its defiant stance against decades of neglect had called to him. 3 times he returned on foot before gathering courage to inspect it closely. The structure was in serious disrepair, roof partially collapsed, porch rotted through, windows long since shattered. But beneath the decay, Eli recognized solid craftsmanship. The hand-hewn beams were oak, the stone foundation laid with skill. Someone had once called this place home and had built it to last. That evening, he'd asked his mother for his father's old journal, the one with the blank pages in the back. Sarah had given him a curious look, but fetched it without question. "Your daddy always said you had his hands, and your grandpa's eyes," she remarked, watching him copy measurements onto the pristine pages. Seeing things as they could be, not just as they are. For weeks, Eli filled the journal with assessments, materials needed, costs estimated. He calculated that with $5 monthly rent, a sum so small even the wealthy miller wouldn't bother negotiating, and his saved earnings, he could gradually transform the cabin. It wouldn't be quick or easy, but the land included nearly 5 acres, with a south-facing slope, perfect for growing. Water likely ran nearby. He'd spotted the characteristic vegetation. His siblings had questioned his sanity. His mother had simply nodded when he explained, then packed him a small bundle of essential tools that had belonged to his father. "Land gives back what you put into it," she'd said, echoing Daniel's words. "Just make sure you're putting in the right things." Now, as Eli closed the journal and glanced around the barely habitable cabin interior, he felt the weight of his ambition. The enormity of the task ahead should have been daunting, but instead it filled him with purpose. This would be more than shelter. It would become a testament to what patience, knowledge, and determination could achieve. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the trees. Eli struck a match to light the small oil lamp. There was work to be done. The handwritten rental agreement lay on the polished mahogany desk, starkly out of place among the fine furnishings of Miller's estate office. One sheet of lined paper, torn from Eli's journal, contained just 3 sentences and 2 signatures. "I do not sell what I do not own," Jacob Miller had said when Eli first inquired about the cabin. His voice carried the practiced authority of inherited wealth, and certainly not to someone who couldn't afford even a reasonable price. Eli had chosen his words carefully. "I'm not looking to buy, sir, just to rent, to fix up." Miller's eyebrows had risen slightly. From his vantage behind the desk, he studied the young man standing before him. Eli's clothes were worn but clean, his posture respectful but not servile. Miller had known the Thompson family distantly, hard-working, honest folk who never asked for charity. "Fix it up? That place is beyond repair." Miller shuffled papers on his desk. A clear dismissal. "Best thing would be to burn it down. Insurance might even cover removal costs." "I believe it can be salvaged," Eli said, "and the land around it has good soil." Miller sighed. "I don't have time for this." "What are you proposing exactly?" $5 monthly, paid in advance. I handle all repairs at my own expense. You retain ownership." A chuckle escaped Miller's lips. "You'd be wasting your money and time. But far be it from me to prevent a man from making his own mistakes." He pulled out a fountain pen worth more than what Eli earned in 2 months. "What did you say your name was again?" "Eli Thompson, sir." "Thompson, yes, your father worked for us at the lumberyard." Miller scribbled the simple agreement on the paper Eli provided. $5 monthly, tenant responsible for all maintenance and improvements. Property remains under ownership of Miller Holdings. He signed with a flourish and slid the paper across the desk. "One condition," Miller added as Eli reached for the agreement. "If you abandon this foolish project within 3 months, which you most certainly will, I don't want to hear about compensation for any improvements you've made." Eli nodded, signing his name in deliberate, careful strokes. "Fair enough." Walking away from Miller's estate, agreement tucked safely in his pocket, Eli felt a curious mixture of anxiety and possibility. The road ahead led through town, where he stopped at Harmon's general store for basic supplies. Ed Harmon, arranging canned goods behind the counter, greeted him with familiar warmth. "Eli, haven't seen you in a week. How's your mother doing?" "She's well, thank you. Working on a quilt for Mrs. Peterson's new grandchild." "Good woman, your mother." Harmon noticed the list in Eli's hand. "That's more than your usual. Something special happening." Eli explained his arrangement with Miller. The shopkeeper's expression shifted from surprise to concern. "That old Carson place, been empty 30 years at least. Roof was half gone last time anyone mentioned it. It needs work," Eli acknowledged. "Quite a bit." Harmon shook his head. "Son, I've known you since you were knee-high, and you've got a good head on your shoulders. But this Miller's just taking your money for nothing." "Maybe," Eli said, "but I'd like to try. Would you extend me credit until the end of month?" Just for these essentials. Harmon hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. For you, yes. But don't throw good money after bad, you hear. Similar reactions followed. Eli through town. The feed store owner looked pained when selling him garden seeds for that wasteland. At the hardware store, old man Jenkins actually tried to talk him out of buying nails. Even the usually taciturn barber commented when Eli passed by. Heard you're fixing up the ghost cabin, he called from his shop door. Better bring a priest along, place is probably haunted. By sunset, Eli had reached the turnoff to the cabin. The narrow dirt path, nearly reclaimed by vegetation, wound upward for nearly half a mile. As he crested the final rise, the structure came into view, silhouetted against the darkening sky. In the fading light, its sorry state was even more apparent than he remembered. The sagging roof, the listing porch, the gaping windows, all seemed to mock his ambition. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Was everyone right? Eli placed his supplies on a relatively stable section of porch and pulled out the rental agreement. In the gathering dusk, he reread the simple contract, 3 sentences that represented not just a business arrangement, but a philosophical divide between seeing value only in perfect things and finding potential in what others discard. Carefully folding the paper, Eli returned it to his pocket and crossed the threshold of what was now, at least temporarily, his. The old hammer felt right in Eli's hand, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. He discovered it while removing a section of damaged wall, tucked away in a cavity as if waiting to be found. The initials J.C. were burned into the handle, John Carson perhaps, the original builder. It was heavier than modern hammers, forged rather than cast, with a solid balance that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. Dawn broke over the eastern ridge as Eli stood in the cabin's center, mentally cataloging the work ahead. The structure's bones remained sound, a testament to its builder's skill, but nearly everything else needed attention. He'd spent his first night on the floor, wrapped in blankets brought from home, listening to the symphony of the building's creaks and the forest's nocturnal rustlings. First, make it watertight, he murmured, reciting his father's wisdom about prioritizing repairs. Then worry about making it pretty. The roof demanded immediate attention. Several sections had collapsed at Lund, while others threatened to follow. Eli climbed carefully onto the structure, testing each rafter before putting his full weight on it. The damage was significant but not catastrophic. Many of the original cedar shingles could be salvaged and repositioned, supplemented with new material where necessary. Working methodically, Eli cleared debris from the collapsed sections. He uncovered more evidence of the cabin's history, a rusted tin toy, fragments of a china plate, a child's marble. Each item he set aside carefully, small treasures from lives once lived within these walls. By midday, he had exposed the roof's skeleton. The main ridge beam had split, causing the cascade of subsequent failures. This would require ingenuity to repair with limited resources. Eli sketched several possibilities in his journal, finally settling on a solution that would use lumber salvaged from the damaged porch. Borrow from Peter to pay Paul, he said to himself with a smile, remembering his mother's expression for making do. Inside, the cabin held both challenges and unexpected gifts. The stone fireplace remained structurally sound, despite years of neglect. A thorough cleaning and minor mortar repairs would restore its function. The plank floors, buried under debris, revealed themselves to be wide-cut oak when swept clean, needing only careful attention to secure loose boards. As afternoon lengthened toward evening, Eli cleared a space large enough to serve as a temporary living area. He arranged his modest possessions, the blankets, a lantern, cooking utensils, his journal, and the books he'd borrowed from the county library on cabin restoration. The hammer he placed reverently beside these treasures, a talisman, connecting past and future. That night, exhausted but satisfied, he built a small fire in the cleared fireplace, having tested the chimney cautiously earlier in the day. The dancing flames pushed back the darkness, illuminating his progress and casting ambitious shadows against the walls. Outside, an owl called, and somewhere in the distance, a fox barked its staccato warning. Eli added the day's observations to his journal, sketching the repaired sections and noting materials needed for tomorrow's tasks. The work ahead was daunting, but for the first time, it felt tangible rather than theoretical. The cabin wasn't just a structure, it was becoming a conversation between its original builder and himself, each problem a question, each solution a respectful answer across time. Sleep came quickly, deeper than the previous night. His dreams were filled with images of the cabin transformed, not into something grand or showy, but into something authentic and alive again. Morning arrived with unexpected glory. Eli woke to sunlight streaming through the eastern windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in golden beams. He stepped onto the unstable porch, mug of coffee warming his hands, and truly saw the land for the first time. The rising sun revealed what had been obscured in his previous evening arrivals and focused daytime work: the property's remarkable beauty. The cabin sat on a small natural bench halfway up the mountainside, overlooking a gentle slope that cradled the morning light. Mature apple trees, gone wild but still productive, dotted the incline. Beyond them, a meadow swayed with grasses and wildflowers, giving way to forest that climbed to the ridgeline. Eli stood motionless, taking it all in. The hammer hung from his belt, a comfortable weight against his thigh. In that moment, the enormity of his task seemed not like a burden, but a privilege. The chance to breathe life back into a place that deserved to be more than just another forgotten corner of Miller's vast holdings. "Thank you," he whispered, though to whom or what he couldn't have said precisely. The newspaper clipping was small, tucked away on page 6 of the Oak Ridge Weekly Herald, beneath advertisements for Harmon's General Store summer sale and Dr. Wilson's veterinary services. "Mountain Restoration or Fool's Errand," read the headline in modest type. Beneath it, 3 short paragraphs described how local youth Eli Thompson has undertaken the curious project of rehabilitating the long-abandoned Carson cabin on Miller property, despite widespread skepticism about the wisdom of such an endeavor. Eli had first seen the article when Bill Harmon, Ed's 16-year-old son, delivered supplies to the cabin one afternoon. "Dad said you might need these extra nails," Bill had said, handing over a small paper bag along with the items Eli had actually ordered. Then, with poorly concealed curiosity, "The newspaper man was asking about you in town yesterday." "Was he?" Eli continued, unloading the supplies, organizing them methodically on shelves he'd constructed from reclaimed lumber. "Yeah. Everybody's talking about what you're doing up here." Bill glanced around, taking in the partially repaired roof, the newly glazed windows, the cleared yard. "Dad said you were crazy at first, but now he's not so sure." After Bill left, Eli had found the newspaper folded at the bottom of the delivery box. He read the article with mixed emotions. While not overtly mocking, it carried a tone of amused disbelief, referring to him as the mountain fool in one passage and quoting Jacob Miller's assessment that the project was an exercise in futility, but harmless enough. The article now hung on a nail beside the door, a reminder of the gap between others' perceptions and his own vision. That gap widened as word spread throughout Oak Ridge. When Eli visited town for supplies the following week, he found himself the subject of curious stares and unsolicited opinions. "Heard you're fixing up the haunted Carson place," called Frank Wilson from the barber shop doorway. "Better you than me. They say old man Carson still walks those floors at midnight." At the hardware store, Jenkins shook his head while measuring out nails. "Roof's too far gone. Should have started from scratch. Waste of good materials to patch something that broken." Even sympathetic community members seemed doubtful. Martha Stevens, who taught at the county school, stopped Eli outside the post office. "It's admirable what you're attempting," she said, her voice gentle with concern. "But winter comes early up on that ridge. Would be awful if you put all this work in and couldn't make it through the cold months." Only at the library did Eli find respite from judgment. Miss Peterson simply provided the books he requested on root cellars and solar orientation without comment, adding an unexpected volume on traditional Appalachian furniture construction. "Thought this might interest you," she said with a quiet smile. The most difficult encounter came at Harmon's general store, where Eli went to settle his monthly account. 3 older men were gathered around the wood stove, despite the summer heat, their conversation falling silent as he entered. "Here he comes now," one muttered. "The mountain miracle worker." Ed Harmon looked uncomfortable as he totaled Eli's bill. "Don't mind them," he said quietly. "They've got nothing better to talk about." Eli nodded, counting out the payment carefully from his dwindling funds. The spring repairs had cost more than anticipated, and Miller's rent, though small, was still due regardless of his progress. "I heard the Carson place had bad water," one of the men called out. "Sulphur springs nearby poisoned the well. That's why they left in the first place." "The water's fine," Eli replied evenly, though he'd tested it thoroughly before using it. "Clear and sweet. For now, maybe," another chimed in, "but wait till August drought hits. That creek up there dries to nothing." Eli pocketed his receipt without responding further, but as he turned to leave, a voice called from the back of the store. "They said the same about my place back in '52. The speaker was William Hatcher, 83 years old, and the oldest resident of Oak Ridge. He sat in his customary chair by the pickle barrel, barely visible in the store's dim corner. "Everyone told me Buzzard Ridge was too rocky, too steep, too everything." The old man's voice carried surprising strength. "But that farm's fed my family for 7 decades now," his roomy eyes fixed on Eli. "Sometimes the land just waits for the right person." The unexpected support lingered with Eli as he walked back toward the mountain. The path seemed less steep somehow, his pack of supplies less heavy. As the cabin came into view, he noticed for the first time how the afternoon light caught the newly repaired eastern wall, warming the aged wood to a honey glow. He carefully added William Hatcher's words to his journal that evening, right below where he'd pasted the newspaper clipping. The cornerstone sat on Eli's makeshift workbench, distinct from the other foundation stones he'd examined and cleaned. Roughly the size of a bread loaf, its outer face was smooth, almost polished compared to its rough-hewn siblings. More intriguing was what he'd discovered on its hidden inner surface, carefully etched initials and a date, JC 1887, confirming his suspicions about the cabin's origins and original builder. Eli had noticed the foundation issues his first week, a sagging eastern corner where water runoff had gradually undermined the structure. Left unaddressed, it would eventually compromise the entire cabin. The solution wasn't complicated, but it demanded painstaking work. Each stone in the affected section needed to be temporarily removed, the ground properly graded and packed, and then the foundation carefully reconstructed. "Stone upon stone," Eli murmured, channeling his father's patience. "No shortcuts." He began at dawn, using an old car jack borrowed from Doc Wilson to carefully support the cabin's weight while he worked. Each stone was numbered and mapped in his journal before removal, its position in the foundation's puzzle documented meticulously. By mid-morning, sweat soaked his shirt, despite the mild spring air. The physical labor, lifting stones weighing 30 to 50 pounds each, tested his strength, but the precision required exercised his mind equally. This wasn't just repair, it was archaeological conversation with the original builder. It was during this process that he'd discovered the cornerstone with its hidden inscription. John Carson, the name matched county records. Miss Peterson had helped him locate. The Carson family had homesteaded several properties in the area during the late 1800s, eventually moving west during the Depression. Eli found himself working with newfound reverence, imagining Carson's hands shaping these same stones nearly a century earlier. Had he worked alone, or had neighbors helped? Had he known the structure would still stand, however compromised, after decades of abandonment? The eastern corner fully dismantled, Eli assessed the revealed earth. As suspected, years of water flow had created a depression. He spent hours hauling gravel from the creek bed, creating a drainage channel below the foundation level, and building up a stable base. Physical exhaustion began to set in, but he pushed forward, knowing rain could undo his progress if the work remained incomplete. Mid-afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Martha Stevens, the schoolteacher who had expressed concern in town, appeared on the path, carrying a basket. "Hope you don't mind," she called as she approached. "I was collecting specimens for our science class and thought you might appreciate some lunch." Eli straightened, embarrassed by his disheveled appearance, but grateful for the interruption. "That's very kind. Thank you." Martha set the basket on a flat rock and surveyed his work with genuine interest. "This is more involved than I imagined. The foundation shifted over time," Eli explained, pointing out the drainage issues. "I'm essentially doing what the original builder should have." "And who was that?" "John Carson, 1887. Eli showed her the inscribed cornerstone, and her eyes lit with recognition. "Carson, we have his family's documents in the school archives. He kept meticulous construction records." She examined the stonework with new appreciation. "I could bring you copies if you'd like." The offer sparked an unexpected connection, not just to historical documents, but to someone who shared his interest in preservation. Their conversation flowed easily over the simple lunch she'd brought: cornbread, cold chicken, and early strawberries. Before leaving, Martha studied the foundation work with respect. "You know, when people in town talk about you, they're not just skeptical. Some are impressed, but don't know how to show it. We've grown used to tearing down and replacing, not restoring." After she left, Eli returned to his task with renewed energy. The remainder of the afternoon passed in steady progress. By sunset, he had rebuilt half the eastern corner. Each stone returned to its rightful place, but now resting on proper drainage and support. Exhausted but satisfied, Eli washed in the creek as evening settled over the mountain. His muscles ached, his hands were raw despite gloves, but the pain carried purpose. The foundation, both literal and metaphorical, was growing stronger. That night, by lamplight, he added detailed notes to his journal, including a sketch of the cornerstone and its inscription. On impulse, he added his own initials and the current year below Carson's, separated by decades, but united in purpose. Before sleeping, Eli placed the cornerstone on the small shelf he'd built near his bed. Tomorrow it would return to the foundation, its inscription hidden once more within the structure. But tonight it served as a tangible reminder that he wasn't the first to see potential in this place. He was merely continuing a conversation across time, adding his voice to a story that had begun long before him. As sleep claimed him, Eli wondered what mark he would leave for someone to discover in another century. The spring emerged from beneath a jumble of moss-covered rocks, its presence betrayed only by the lush vegetation surrounding it and the subtle sound of water moving underground. Eli had discovered it while clearing brush from the western edge of the property, following a patch of unusually vibrant growth that seemed out of place in the otherwise dry dune landscape. Kneeling beside the rocks, he carefully removed debris that had accumulated over decades of neglect. The water that eventually appeared was crystal clear and cold even in the summer heat, a hidden treasure that would transform his prospects on the mountain. Eli cupped his hands and tasted the water. Sweet and mineral-rich, it was better than the creek water he'd been using since his arrival. With proper development, this spring could provide year-round water for drinking, cooking, and irrigation, independent of seasonal rainfall. Back at the cabin, Eli opened his journal to a fresh page and began a careful mapping of the property's natural resources. The spring took center place, its location marked with precise measurements from the cabin's corner. Around it, he added other discoveries from his systematic exploration of the land. The wild apple orchard occupied the southeastern slope, 5 trees that had once been part of a deliberate planting but had reverted to a semi-wild state. Despite their untended condition, they showed signs of good rootstock. With proper pruning, they might produce decent fruit by fall. Beyond the apples, a small clearing revealed the remnants of what must have been Carson's vegetable garden. The soil there was darker, enriched by generations of compost and care, then left to rest for decades. Eli had already planted a test patch of potatoes and beans there, which were thriving despite minimal attention. The northern boundary yielded another surprise, a stand of mature maple trees, perfect for syrup production in late winter. The western slope, too steep for cultivation, was nonetheless valuable for its hickory and oak, providing both wood and nuts. Each discovery reinforced Eli's growing conviction. What Miller saw as worthless land actually held abundant resources for someone willing to work in partnership with its natural patterns. The property wasn't suitable for conventional farming or development, but for a sustainable homestead, it was nearly perfect. Eli spent the afternoon designing a system to harness the spring. Using the technical books Miss Peterson had provided, he sketched a simple collection basin that would feed a gravity-powered pipeline to the cabin. The elevation difference would provide enough pressure for basic needs, and excess water could be diverted to irrigate the garden during dry periods. As evening approached, Eli gathered materials to mark the boundaries of the garden he envisioned. Using stakes and twine salvaged from the cabin's demolition debris, he outlined beds that would follow the contour of the land rather than fighting against it. The light was fading when William Hatch's grandson, James, arrived unexpectedly with a delivery from his grandfather. Several seedlings wrapped in damp burlap. "Grandpa said you might find a use for these," the young man explained. "They're berry cuttings from his place. Said they've been growing there since before he was born." The gift, raspberry, blackberry, and an unusual variety of blueberry, adapted to the mountain's acidic soil, was more valuable than James could know. These established cultivars, already adapted to local conditions, would save Eli years of experimentation. "Your grandfather's too generous," Eli said, carefully unwrapping the plants. "Please thank him for me." James surveyed the garden outline with interest. "Grandpa said you're doing it right, working with the land instead of against it. Not many folks think that way anymore." He hesitated. "Mind if I come by sometime? Might be things I could learn here." After James departed, Eli immediately prepared a sheltered bed for the berry cuttings. As he worked, his thoughts returned to the spring. Beyond its practical value, there was something symbolically fitting about its discovery, a hidden source of life-giving water that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized and developed with care. That evening, Eli added the spring to his growing inventory of the land's gifts: the foundation stones, the mature trees, the fertile soil, the wild fruit. Each represented not just material resources, but a kind of conversation between the land's past and its potential future. By lamplight, he finalized his designs for the spring catchment system, listing materials needed and calculating costs against his dwindling savings. The investment would be significant, but the return immeasurable. Reliable water would make everything else possible. Before sleeping, Eli filled his cup directly from the spring for the first time. The water caught the lamp's glow like liquid crystal. He drank deeply, feeling a connection to all who had refreshed themselves from this same source across generations. The Carsons, certainly, but perhaps others before them, stretching back to the original inhabitants of these mountains. The spring wasn't just a resource, it was an inheritance, a responsibility, and a promise. The quilt arrived without ceremony, left on Eli's newly repaired porch while he worked in the west field. A simple note pinned to its corner read, "Mountain nights get cold. Sarah Thompson taught me to quilt 30 years ago. Seems fitting her son should have this one. Martha Wilson." Eli unfolded it carefully, revealing a masterwork of craft and patience. The pattern, log cabin, was traditional, but executed with exceptional skill. Each piece was hand-stitched, the backing sturdy cotton, the batting thick enough for genuine warmth. Examining it closely, he recognized scraps of fabric that told community stories, a piece from the church bazaar tablecloth, Another from the shirts the mine workers wore on Sundays, even a small square that might have come from his own childhood coat. The gift couldn't have been more timely. October had arrived with unexpected ferocity, bringing the first frost 2 weeks earlier than anyone predicted. The thermometer Eli had mounted beside the door registered 28 degrees that morning, and the weather-wise among the townsfolk warned this was just the beginning. Winter's coming early and hard, William Hatcher had told him during his last trip to Harmon's store. When the oak leaves turn bottom side up like they did last week, that's the mountains telling you to prepare. Eli had been preparing, harvesting the modest garden, splitting wood from cleared trees, canning preserves from wild berries and apples. But the cabin itself remained his greatest concern. The roof was sound now, the chimney cleared and repaired, but drafts found their way through walls that needed more comprehensive sealing than he'd managed so far. That evening, as darkness fell hours earlier than it had just weeks before, Eli took stock of his situation. The spring he'd developed provided reliable water, delivered now through a simple gravity-fed pipe that he drained each evening to prevent freezing. Food stores were adequate, though not abundant enough to last through January with careful rationing. Firewood was plentiful, thanks to months of systematic clearing and splitting. But as the first serious cold snap descended, Eli discovered just how many invisible paths the mountain wind could find into his shelter. He spent an entire day stuffing cracks with a mixture of mud, straw, and lime, working from inside as bitter gusts buffeted the outer walls. The improvements helped, but that night he slept in his coat, the precious quilt wrapped tightly around him. Dawn brought 4 inches of wet, heavy snow, beautiful but ominous. The calendar said it was only the 3rd week of October, traditionally still harvest season. If winter was arriving this early, how long would it last? Eli forced himself outside to make final preparations, covering the garden's root vegetables with extra mulch, ensuring the firewood was properly sheltered, setting primitive gutters to direct snow melt away from the foundation. His fingers grew numb despite gloves, and his breath hung in clouds around his head. By afternoon, the snow had deepened to 7 inches and showed no signs of stopping. The forest fell eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional crack of branches surrendering to their white burden. Inside, Eli built up the fire and consulted the weather journals Martha had shared from the school archives. If Carson's observations from the 1890s held true, this early snow likely meant a winter of unusual severity. That night, the temperature plummeted to 15 degrees, and the wind rose to a mournful howl. Eli moved his sleeping pallet closer to the fireplace, piling every available covering over himself, the quilt uppermost and most effective. Still, the cold seemed to radiate from the very walls, seeping into his bones. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the need to add wood to the fire. During one such waking period, near what he guessed was midnight, Eli heard a sharp crack, followed by a deep groan from the cabin's frame. The sound jolted him fully awake, alert to the possibility of structural failure under the storm's pressure. For the next hour he moved carefully around the interior, checking for signs of damage. In the northwest corner, he discovered a long seam opening between logs as the wood contracted in the extreme cold. Using the last of his prepared chinking mixture, he made emergency repairs by firelight. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a crystalline world of white outside his frosted windows. The thermometer registered 9 degrees, the coldest October day in local memory. Moving stiffly in the pre-dawn darkness, Eli rekindled the fire and assessed his situation with ruthless honesty. The cabin had withstood its first test, but barely, without significant improvements, it might not survive a truly deep winter freeze. His supplies, while carefully planned, hadn't accounted for a season that might stretch weeks longer than normal. Wrapping the quilt around his shoulders, Eli opened his journal to a fresh page. Survival would require more than just endurance. It demanded adaptation. Beside the fire's growing warmth, he began sketching designs for interior walls that could be insulated with dried grasses and clay, a more efficient wood stove arrangement, and double-thickness shutters for the windows. Outside, the brilliant winter sun rose over a transformed landscape. The mountain's challenge had been issued. With Martha's quilt warming his shoulders, Eli prepared his response. The gold watch caught the late November sunlight as Jacob Miller checked the time for the third time in 15 minutes. Standing on what was now a sturdy porch, he shifted uncomfortably, clearly impatient for Eli to finish gathering the rent money from inside the cabin. The visit had come without warning. Eli had been splitting wood when the expensive black sedan had appeared on the narrow access road, looking absurdly out of place against the rugged mountain backdrop. Miller had emerged wearing a cashmere overcoat and leather gloves that had clearly never been used for labor. Quarterly inspection, he'd announced without greeting, and rent collection, of course. Eli, wiping sweat despite the cold, had invited him inside. The invitation seemed to surprise Miller, who hesitated before following him into the cabin with visible reluctance, as if expecting dirt to leap onto his polished shoes. Inside, Miller had stood awkwardly, his tall frame seeming too large for the modest space. His eyes, however, betrayed genuine surprise as they traveled across the transformed interior. The cabin Eli had rented 6 months earlier barely resembled the structure that now stood. The sagging roof had been completely rebuilt with salvaged and new materials. Windows that had been broken shells now held tight-fitting glass panes, some clear, others of bottle glass in decorative patterns. The stone fireplace, once choked with debris and home to various creatures, now housed a well-designed fire that filled the space with even warmth. "You've been busy," Miller said, struggling to maintain his usual detachment. "It's coming along," Eli replied modestly. "Would you like some coffee?" "Just made it." The question seemed to confuse Miller, as if the idea of consuming anything produced in this environment was inconceivable, yet something, curiosity perhaps, or simple politeness, led him to nod stiffly. Eli poured the coffee into 2 mugs, one a proper ceramic piece, the other a tin cup kept for visitors, and offered Miller the better one. The rich aroma filled the small space, momentarily creating a bridge between the two men from vastly different worlds. "Local blend?" Miller asked, clearly surprised by the quality. "From my own beans, actually. Small crop this year, but promising." Miller's eyebrows rose. "You're growing coffee? Here?" "Just experimenting. The southern slope creates a microclimate that's surprisingly hospitable to certain plants." Eli gestured toward the window, where the cleared land was visible. The first frost came late on that section. For a moment, Miller's facade of disinterest cracked, revealing genuine curiosity. He moved to the window, coffee forgotten in his hand, and studied the neat rows of Eli's garden, the terraced beds following the land's natural contours, the small but growing orchard of rescued and newly planted fruit trees. "That's unexpected," he said finally. "I was under the impression this land was essentially worthless except for timber." "Not worthless," Eli corrected quietly. "Just requiring a different approach than conventional agriculture." Miller sipped his coffee absently, his attention caught by the detailed maps and plans Eli had pinned to one wall, the product of months of observation and experimentation. "You've documented everything. Helps me track what works and what doesn't." Eli hesitated, then added, "The original owner, John Carson, kept similar records. His granddaughter shared some with me. Seems we've encountered many of the same challenges, just a century apart." Something shifted in Miller's expression, a recognition perhaps that the land he owned as mere numbers on a ledger had a history and character he'd never considered. The moment passed quickly. Miller placed his half-finished coffee on the small table and straightened his coat. "Well, the rent, if you please. $15 for the quarter." Now standing on the porch while Eli retrieved the money, Miller consulted his watch again. the gold gleaming incongruously against the weathered wood and stone backdrop. The timepiece was clearly expensive, possibly inherited. A Patek Philippe that might have cost as much as Eli would earn in several years. Eli emerged with the carefully counted bills. As Miller pocketed them without counting, his gaze drifted over the improvements to the cabin's exterior, the repaired roof, the reinforced chimney, the cleared yard now containing neatly stacked firewood, and the beginnings of a rock garden. "You're determined to prove me wrong, aren't you, Thompson?" There was no hostility in the question, just puzzled curiosity. "Not at all, sir. Just making a home." Miller nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. As he turned to leave, he paused. "The road's getting treacherous. Won't be able to make it up here once serious snow falls. You might want to consider wintering down in town. Appreciate the concern, but I'll be fine." Made preparations. Miller studied him for a long moment, then nodded again. "Your choice, of course." He walked to his car, then turned back. "Interesting coffee. Never would have thought it possible up here." As the expensive vehicle carefully navigated the rough road back down the mountain, Eli remained on the porch, watching until it disappeared around the bend. The encounter had been brief, yet something had shifted. Miller had arrived expecting to find failure, or at best, minimal progress. He'd departed with questions that his gold watch and cashmere coat couldn't answer. Inside, Eli added a log to the fire and made an entry in his journal, recording not just Miller's visit, but the subtle change in the man's perception. It wasn't approval exactly, but perhaps the first hint of something more valuable: respect. The harvest basket sat on the newly built kitchen table, its willow frame woven by Eli during the long winter evenings. Within it lay the first tangible rewards of spring: tender lettuce leaves, radishes with their fire engine tops, wild ramps gathered from the forest edge, and a handful of early strawberries that had somehow survived both frost and foraging animals. Eli ran his fingers over the basket's smooth rim, marveling at how such simple things could provide such profound satisfaction. The winter had been brutal, worse than even the oldest residents could recall. January had brought 3 feet of snow in a single storm, followed by temperatures that plunged to 20 below zero. February hadn't relented, adding ice storms that coated every surface in crystalline armor. For nearly 6 weeks, Eli had been completely isolated, the road to town impassable except on foot, and even that journey too dangerous to attempt in the worst weather. His careful preparations had been tested to their limits. The root cellar had proven its worth, keeping potatoes, carrots, and apples from freezing. The extra insulation he'd added to the cabin walls had made the difference between discomfort and genuine peril. There had been moments of doubt. A night when the wind found new paths through the chinked logs, sending the temperature inside plummeting. A week when illness had left him feverish and weak, forcing him to melt snow for water when he couldn't make it to the spring. But he had endured, and more than endured. He had used the enforced solitude to plan, to dream, to refine his vision for the land. Now, with April warming toward May, that vision was beginning to materialize. The garden, expanded to 3 times its original size, showed neat rows of emerging crops. The fruit trees he'd pruned and cared for through the fall were heavy with blossom. The honeybees he'd traded for during his last pre-winter visit to town were busily establishing their hive in the shelter he'd built for them. Most gratifying were the structures he'd created during the winter's indoor days. Besides the basket, there was a complete set of kitchen shelves made from reclaimed pine, a rocking chair fashioned after a design in one of Martha's books, and a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light, small comforts that transformed mere shelter into home. The cabin itself had evolved from a weather-tight refuge to a place of genuine charm. Eli had laid a stone path from the porch to the garden, built flower boxes beneath the windows, and added a covered extension off the kitchen where he could work in all weathers. The interior walls, once bare logs, now featured shelves, hooks for tools and cooking implements, and even a few decorative touches, a carved wooden panel above the fireplace, curtains sewn from feed sacks dyed with walnut hulls. Standing in the doorway, surveying his domain on this perfect spring morning, Eli felt a contentment that transcended mere pride of ownership. This place, this small corner of creation, responded to his care in ways that felt like conversation. He gave attention, it gave abundance. The feeling had deepened when James Hatcher, old William's grandson, had hiked up through the last of the melting snow 2 weeks earlier, carrying supplies from town and news of the outside world. "Grandpa said to check if you'd made it," James had explained, dropping a heavy pack on the porch. "A lot of folks didn't think you would. Not through a winter like this one." "Almost didn't. A time or two," Eli had admitted. "But the place is solid. Taught me what it needed." James had walked the property with him, asking questions, offering occasional suggestions, clearly impressed by what he saw. "You've done more with this piece in 8 months than most would in 5 years, he'd said finally. "Grandpa says you've got the mountain in your blood, same as our people." Now, as morning sunlight streamed across the yard, Eli selected a radish from the basket and bit into it, savoring the sharp, clean taste of new growth. The simple act connected him to the land in a visceral way. This flavor, this nourishment, born directly from his labor and the soil's generosity. He made a careful entry in his journal, noting the date of first harvest, the varieties that had performed best, the areas where drainage issues still needed addressing. Such record-keeping had become second nature, a practice that honored both the scientific approach he valued and the tradition of the mountain people who had worked this land before him. The morning's tasks awaited, transplanting the seedlings he'd started indoors, clearing new ground for summer squash and melons, checking the spring's collection base. But for this moment, Eli allowed himself to simply stand in the sun, harvest basket beside him, surveying the transformation a year had brought. From the distant ridge came the sound of a pileated woodpecker, its staccato drumming echoing across the valley. A pair of bluebirds flitted around the nest box he'd mounted near the garden. From the town far below, too distant to see, came the faint sound of the church bell marking the hour. Eli picked up the basket and moved toward the garden, ready to continue what had become not just a project, but a way of life. The visitor's log began as a joke. Martha Stevens had brought it during one of her increasingly frequent visits, presenting the leather-bound book with mock formality. "Since you're becoming such a popular destination," she'd said with a smile, "you ought to keep track of your admirers." Eli had laughed, setting the empty book on the small table he'd built for the porch. He never expected anyone to actually use it, but use it they did. First Martha herself, signing her name with a teacher's precise penmanship and adding, "First official visitor to Thompson's Folly," which isn't such a folly after all. Then James Hatcher, who came to learn about Eli's irrigation system. Doc Wilson, bringing a remedy for Eli's persistent cough and staying for dinner. Even Ed Harmon, delivering supplies but lingering to examine the garden's impressive yield. Within a month, the first page bore 12 signatures, each accompanied by brief comments. "Remarkable strawberry, clever use of South Slope. Best cornbread since my grandmother's." The log now lay open on the porch table, catching the gentle breeze of a perfect June evening. Eli studied the latest entry as he rocked in the chair he'd crafted over winter. The view alone was worth the climb, but the company made it memorable. Reverend Thomas Clark. The minister's visit that afternoon had been unexpected. Clark was new to the area, having taken over the town's small church just months earlier, and Eli had only met him briefly during rare trips to town. Yet the man had appeared on his doorstep, slightly winded from the climb but smiling broadly. "Hope I'm not intruding," Clark had said. "Word of your place has reached even my corner of town, and I confess to curiosity." They had walked the property together, Clark asking thoughtful questions not just about the practical aspects, the garden layout, the spring development, but about Eli's philosophy in approaching the land. "You've something that honors both the past and future," he'd observed, watching bees move industriously between flower boxes and hive. a rare achievement in our disposable age. The Reverend's visit was only the latest indication of the community's shifting perception. What had begun as skepticism, even mockery, had gradually transformed into something else. Interest, respect, and increasingly, a desire to learn. Eli found himself hosting impromptu demonstrations, how to graft apple trees, build a cold frame using salvaged windows, preserve vegetables without a pressure canner. Knowledge he'd gathered from books and experience now flowed back into the community that had initially doubted him. Most surprising were the gifts visitors began to bring, not out of charity but exchange. Martha contributed books and historical records. James Hatcher brought cuttings from old fruit varieties preserved on his grandfather's land. The Wilson children delivered a hand-carved sign reading Thompson's Place that now hung by the gate. Even Frank from the barber shop, who had been among the most vocal skeptics, arrived one day with 2 heritage chickens. "Heard you might be interested in these old breeds," he'd said gruffly. "My grandfather raised them. Too ornery for most folks nowadays, but they're good layers in winter." Today had brought another milestone. Sarah Mackenzie, who wrote for the same local paper that had once mocked Eli's fool's errand, had asked permission to feature the cabin in a series about sustainable living. "People are looking for alternatives," she'd explained. "Your approach could inspire others." Eli closed the visitor's log and leaned back in his rocker, watching lightning bugs begin their evening display over the meadow. The transformation of the property was evident: thriving gardens, repaired structures, healthy livestock. But equally significant was the transformation of relationships, the weaving of his solitary project into the broader community fabric. Not everyone had changed their opinion, of course. Some still viewed his efforts as eccentric at best, pointless at worst. Jenkins from the hardware store still made comments about real houses with modern conveniences. The county commissioner had suggested the land would be better used for development, and Jacob Miller remained an enigma. After his winter visit, he had sent rent receipts through his office rather than collecting in person. Occasionally, Eli spotted Miller's expensive car passing slowly on the road below, but the man never turned up the drive. The evening deepened, stars appearing in the darkening sky. From inside the cabin, the radio played softly, one luxury Eli had allowed himself, powered by a small solar panel he'd installed in spring. The announcer's voice faded in and out with the mountain's temperamental reception, reporting news from distant places that seemed increasingly remote from the life he'd built here. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, a group from the Agricultural Extension Office, interested in his experiments with heritage grain varieties. The day after, several high school students would arrive to help with the summer harvest in exchange for learning traditional preservation techniques. Eli made a final entry in his journal before turning in, noting the date and a simple observation: "What began as shelter has become a bridge." He touched the visitor's log gently before carrying it inside, protecting it from the gathering evening dew. The names within it represented more than casual visits. They were evidence of something he hadn't sought, but now deeply valued, a community finding its way back to forgotten wisdom, gathered around a place once deemed worthless, now revealing its true abundance. The water wheel turned steadily in the late summer light, its wooden paddles catching the flow from the spring-fed stream and converting it to gentle, rhythmic motion. Eli stood back, watching with quiet satisfaction as the mechanism he designed over countless evening hours finally performed its intended purpose. The wheel itself was a masterwork of practical engineering, crafted primarily from salvaged materials, yet precise in its construction. The axle came from an abandoned farm implement Eli had discovered in the woods. The paddles were shaped from cedar planks, reclaimed during the cabin's roof repair. The bearings he'd traded for in town, one of his few actual purchases for the project. What made the wheel truly remarkable, however, was its dual purpose. The primary shaft connected to a simple generator that produced enough electricity to power the cabin's modest needs: lights, a radio, and occasionally a small refrigerator. A secondary gearing system diverted some of the energy to pump water to the expanded garden's irrigation network, ensuring consistent moisture regardless of rainfall patterns. "It's like something from another century, but better," James Hatcher had observed. During its construction, the young man had become Eli's most frequent visitor, eager to learn techniques that bridged traditional wisdom with modern understanding. Indeed, the wheel represented Eli's entire philosophy, honoring old knowledge while incorporating new insights, working with natural systems rather than against them, creating elegant solutions from limited resources. Nothing wasted, everything serving multiple purposes. Today marked the wheel's official inauguration. After weeks of testing, adjusting and refining, Eli had invited a small group to witness the system in full operation. Martha Stevens arrived first, bringing her usual offering of fresh baked bread and keen observation. The Wilson children followed, scrambling down the path ahead of their more sedate father. Even Ed Harmon closed his store early to make the journey up the mountain. Most surprising was the appearance of Robert Jenkins from the hardware store, who had been among the project's most vocal skeptics. "Heard you built something worth seeing," he'd said gruffly, handing Eli a small bag of specialized fittings. "Thought these might help with the pressure regulation." As Eli demonstrated the wheel's operation, explaining each component and its function, he watched understanding dawn on their faces, not just of the mechanism's cleverness, but of its deeper significance. This wasn't merely about generating power or irrigating crops. It was about reimagining what was possible when necessity and creativity converged. "You could sell these," Jenkins said, examining the paddle design with professional appreciation. "Plenty of properties around here with running water that could benefit." "Not about selling," Eli replied. "Anyone who wants to build one is welcome to use my design." That evening, after the visitors had departed, Eli sat on the porch, watching the wheel's steady rotation catch the last golden light. Its gentle creaking had already become part of the cabin's ambient soundtrack, a counterpoint to the wind in the pines and the distant calls of whippoorwills starting their evening chorus. The wheel represented a turning point in more ways than one. With reliable power and irrigation, the cabin had evolved from a survival project to a truly sustainable homestead. The expanded garden now produced more than Eli could consume, allowing him to trade surplus at the town's small farmers market. The root cellar was already half filled with preserved food for the coming winter. The improved chicken coop housed a growing flock that provided eggs and natural pest control. Most significant was how the wheel had altered the community's perception. What had begun as Thompson's folly was increasingly referenced as a model of self-sufficiency. The county extension agent had visited twice, taking detailed notes and photographs. 3 other mountain families had already asked for help designing similar systems for their properties. Even Sarah from the local paper, once responsible for the mocking article about Eli's project, had written a feature piece titled "Mountain Ingenuity: Old Ways Meet New Thinking." The article had been picked up by a regional magazine, bringing visitors from as far as 2 counties away. As twilight deepened into evening, Eli lit the oil lamp that still served as his primary indoor light. Despite the new electrical capability, some habits of simplicity remained preferable to progress. Opening his journal, he made detailed notes about the wheel's performance, water flow rates, power generation measurements, bearing temperature after 12 hours of operation. On the final page of the entry, he sketched improvements already taking shape in his mind. A modified paddle design for increased efficiency, a better bearing housing, a more effective filtering system to keep debris from entering the mechanism. The wheel was functioning well, but like everything in Eli's world, it was a conversation rather than a monologue, constantly evolving through observation and adjustment. From the small shelf above his desk, the antique hammer that had been his first discovery in the cabin seemed to observe proceedings with the quiet dignity of a witness to both past and future. Eli touched it briefly before closing his journal, a gesture that had become almost ritualistic, connecting his work to the hands that had first built this place. Outside, the wheel turned steadily in the moonlight, its motion hypnotic and reassuring, a physical manifestation of Eli's growing certainty that he had found not just a place to live, but a way to live that made profound sense. The business card lay on Eli's table, its cream-colored stock and embossed lettering starkly out of place among the cabin's handcrafted furnishings. Jacob Miller, Miller Development and Holdings, it read, with a phone number and address in gold foil beneath. On its back, a handwritten note, "Call when convenient to discuss opportunities." Eli studied it thoughtfully, remembering the unexpected visit earlier that day. Miller had arrived not alone, but with two men in similarly expensive attire, introducing them only as associates interested in local properties. Unlike his previous inspections, this visit had felt like something else entirely, an assessment rather than a collection, an evaluation rather than an obligation. Impressive progress, Miller had commented, gesturing toward the thriving gardens and renovated outbuildings. One of his companions had nodded, making notes on a small pad. "Thank you," Eli had replied simply, continuing to harvest late summer tomatoes as they approached. "You've created quite the attraction," Miller continued. "People in town talk about what you've accomplished here, just making a living," Eli said, uncomfortable with the scrutiny from the three men in their polished shoes and pressed shirts. The trio had toured the property with minimal invitation, examining the water wheel with particular interest. The taller associate had taken photographs with a small camera, stopping to capture the view from several angles. "Unique approach to the limitations of the terrain," the man had remarked, sounding almost like he was conducting an appraisal. Miller had been different too, less dismissive, more attentive, asking questions about the spring development, the soil amendments Eli had created, the heritage fruit varieties he'd established. There was a tension in his manner, a calculation behind his newfound curiosity. The adjacent 50 acres, Miller had mentioned casually as they returned to the cabin. "It's part of my holdings as well. Similar topography to this parcel." "Good land," Eli had acknowledged. "Has potential." "Potential," Miller had repeated, testing the word. "Yes, I'm beginning to understand that concept differently." Now, hours after their departure, Eli turned the business card over in his fingers, contemplating its implications. In the 18 months since he'd begun transforming the worthless cabin, something fundamental had shifted in Miller's assessment. The property he had dismissed as a liability had become, what exactly? An asset? An opportunity? A model for something larger? The second visitor, the one who'd taken notes, had mentioned eco-tourism and authentic experiences when examining the guest cabin Eli had recently added. The third had asked pointed questions about operating costs and potential revenue streams from the various gardens and orchards. Most revealing had been Miller's parting comment as he'd handed over the business card. "There might be ways to expand on what you've started here. Buyers are looking for exactly this kind of authenticity. With proper investment, this concept could be scaled. The word had landed with a dissonant thud against Eli's consciousness. What he'd created wasn't a concept to be replicated. It was a relationship with a specific piece of land, a conversation between his labor and this particular mountainside's character. Outside, the evening light cast long shadows across the terraced gardens, where squash ripened alongside climbing beans and native medicinal herbs. Chickens scratched contentedly in their large enclosure, turning over soil while controlling insects. The apple trees, now properly pruned and bearing heavily, created a dappled pattern against the golden hour light. What Miller and his associates had seen was undeniably successful. The once derelict cabin now stood sturdy and welcoming, its expanded footprint including a root cellar, workshop, and the small guest quarters where Martha's niece had stayed while learning traditional fiber arts last month. The gardens produced far more than one person could eat, allowing Eli to establish regular trade relationships in town. But the success they measured differed fundamentally from what Eli valued. Their interested gazes had seen potential profit where he saw sustenance, a concept where he saw home, a model where he saw relationship. Eli placed the business card in his journal as a bookmark, neither accepting nor rejecting its implicit offer yet. The opportunities Miller wanted to discuss would need careful consideration. Whatever they might be, they would necessarily involve a translation between two worldviews, one that measured value in dollars and development potential, another that calculated worth in sustainability and connection. The dinner bell Martha had given him, salvaged from an old schoolhouse, rang gently in the evening breeze, its clear tone mingling with birdsong and the distant rush of the creek. These were sounds that wouldn't appear in any business proposal, but formed the essential soundtrack of the life he'd built. As darkness gathered, Eli lit the lamps, electric now thanks to the water wheel's power, but deliberately kept dim enough to preserve the night's natural rhythms. He made a simple entry in his journal, recording Miller's visit and the card he'd left behind. The question of how to respond could wait for morning light, but even as he set the matter aside temporarily, Eli recognized that something significant had occurred. The land Miller had once considered worthless now attracted his focused attention. The project he had dismissed as a fool's errand now warranted business cards and associates and discussions of opportunities. It was, in its way, a victory, though one that brought its own complicated challenges. The very success of Eli's vision now potentially threatened its fundamental nature. The question wasn't just what Miller might offer, but what Eli himself truly valued, and what price those values might command in a world increasingly hungry for exactly what he had created. Authenticity, sustainability, and a sense of meaningful connection to place. The table dominated the clearing beside the cabin, its surface rich with the patina of hand-rubbed oils and careful craftsmanship. Eli had built it over 3 weeks, working evenings after his regular chores were complete. 12 feet long and nearly 3 feet wide, it was designed specifically for gathering people together, large enough for a dozen to sit comfortably, sturdy enough to last generations. He'd used oak salvaged from a lightning-struck tree on the property's northern boundary, milling the lumber himself with tools borrowed from James Hatcher. The legs were turned from cherry, their gentle curves suggesting motion despite their solid strength. The joinery employed traditional mortise and tenon techniques, secured with handmade wooden pegs rather than metal fasteners. No nails, no screws, just wood responding to wood, the grain patterns aligned to maximize both beauty and durability. Now that table formed the centerpiece of Eli's first harvest gathering. Around it clustered a collection of chairs, some brought by guests, others crafted by Eli in various stages of his developing woodworking skills. Mismatched in appearance but unified in purpose, they created an informal community circle beneath the dappled shade of apple trees. "Never seen a spread like this outside of Thanksgiving," Ed Harmon commented, surveying the abundance laid across the table's length. Every dish contained food grown, raised, or foraged on Eli's land or traded for with neighbors. Roasted chicken with herbs, vegetables in countless preparations. Fresh-baked bread, preserves, pies made from summer berries. Cider pressed from early apples. "Don't know how you managed all this," Martha added, helping to arrange serving bowls. "Took 3 of us just to prepare the community supper last month." "Had help," Eli acknowledged, nodding toward several neighbors who had arrived early to assist. The gathering had begun as a simple idea, sharing his harvest abundance with those who had supported his journey. But like many aspects of his mountain project, it had evolved organically into something more significant. Word had spread beyond his initial invitations. The Wilsons brought their extended family. Reverend Clark arrived with his wife and several church elders. Even Jenkins from the hardware store appeared, carrying a handcrafted serving platter as his contribution. Most surprising was the arrival of William Hatcher, the elderly mountain resident whose encouragement had meant so much during Eli's early struggles. At 84, he rarely left his own property, making his presence particularly meaningful. His grandson James helped him to a seat of honor at the table's head. "Reminds me of the old days," the elderly man observed, his weathered hand running appreciatively across the table's smooth surface. "Folks used to gather like this regular, barn raisings, harvests, celebrations. Been too long." As the gathering settled into the shared meal, conversation flowed as abundantly as the food. Martha recounted stories from the county's history, many connected directly to the land where they now sat. James described techniques he'd learned from Eli and implemented on his grandfather's property. Children played at the clearing's edge, occasionally returning to the table for another serving or to share some natural treasure discovered in their explorations. "You've created more than a homestead," Reverend Clark observed quietly to Eli as they stood slightly apart watching the scene. "You've revived something our community was losing, connection to land, to tradition, to each other." Eli nodded, uncomfortable with praise but recognizing the truth in the observation. What had begun as a personal project of survival and self-sufficiency had somehow catalyzed something larger. The table before him, laden with food, surrounded by neighbors who had once been skeptics, embodied that unexpected evolution. The afternoon light had mellowed to early evening when a black sedan appeared on the access road. Conversations paused momentarily as Jacob Miller emerged. Today without associates but still conspicuously formal in pressed slacks and a button-down shirt. An awkward silence briefly descended. Miller's position as wealthy landowner and developer created an automatic distance from many community members, especially those who had lost family lands to his acquisitions over the years. Eli moved to greet him, genuinely surprised by his appearance. "Mr. Miller, didn't expect you today. Heard there was quite a gathering," Miller replied, his discomfort evident but contained beneath practiced poise. "Thought I should see what all the talk was about." After a moment of hesitation, Eli gestured toward the table. "Plenty to share. You're welcome to join us." The contrast between Miller's formal attire and the casual gathering created a visual representation of worlds colliding. As he took a seat offered by Martha, ever the diplomat, the conversation gradually resumed. Though with noticeable reserve, Miller ate little but observed much, his gaze traveling from the abundant table to the thriving gardens beyond, from the sturdy cabin with its recent additions to the water wheel turning steadily in the distance. Whatever calculations ran behind his carefully composed expression remained private, but his attention was undeniably focused. As the gathering continued around him, the unlikely landlord remained a figure slightly apart, connected by proximity but separated by perspective. When William Hatcher began sharing stories of the mountain's history, including the original Carson homestead that had preceded Eli's renovation, Miller listened with particular intensity, occasionally glancing at the land as if seeing it through new eyes. The handcrafted table at the center of it all seemed to embody the questions hanging unspoken in the air. What truly constitutes value? Who determines the best use of land? How do we balance individual vision with community needs? What is worth preserving and what should be developed? These questions remained unaddressed directly, but they wove through the gathering like invisible threads, connecting the participants in a conversation larger than their spoken words, a conversation to which the carefully crafted table provided both foundation and witness. The envelope lay unopened on Eli's writing desk, its heavyweight cream paper and embossed letterhead marking it as distinctly different from his usual correspondence. Miller Development and Holdings was printed in raised ink across the top, with the same gold foil accents that adorned Jacob Miller's business cards. It had arrived by courier rather than regular mail. A young man in a company polo shirt who had driven the winding mountain road in a polished sedan. "Mr. Miller asked me to deliver this personally and wait for your initial response," he'd explained, standing awkwardly on the porch while Eli examined the sealed envelope. Inside, according to the courier, was a formal proposal, the culmination of Miller's growing interest over recent months. Since the harvest gathering 2 weeks earlier, Miller had visited twice more, each time bringing different specialists: an architect who studied the cabin's construction with professional interest, a landscape designer who spent hours walking the property and taking soil samples, a marketing consultant who asked probing questions about Eli's techniques and philosophy. Now the purpose behind those visits was apparently ready for revelation. Eli placed the envelope under a stone paperweight without opening it, telling the courier he would need time to consider whatever it contained. "Mr. Miller expected you might say that," the young man had replied with practiced politeness. "He asked me to inform you that he's available at your convenience to discuss the contents in person." After the courier departed, Eli went about his afternoon chores, tending the chickens, checking the water wheel's mechanism, harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes before frost claimed them. The envelope remained on the desk, its presence somehow altering the cabin's atmosphere despite its silence. Evening brought Martha Stevens, who arrived with her usual offering of fresh bread and community news. Her gaze immediately found the envelope, recognizing its significance without being told. "So he's made his move," she said, in placing the bread on the counter. "Haven't opened it yet," Eli replied. "Setting water to boil for tea, but you know what it contains." Eli nodded slowly. Miller's intentions had become increasingly transparent. The adjacent 50 acres he'd mentioned, the references to scaling what Eli had created, the specialists measuring and assessing. It wasn't difficult to interpret. "He wants to build something larger based on what you've done here," Martha said, accepting the cup Eli offered. "Turn your homestead into a development concept. Seems likely." Martha studied him over the rim of her cup. "And how do you feel about that?" The question hung between them as Eli considered his response. How did he feel? The project that had begun as Thompson's Folly had become something that attracted wealthy developers and specialists. The land Miller had once deemed worthless now apparently held value worth formally proposing for. "Complicated," he finally answered. After Martha left, Eli sat at the desk and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a multi-page document with "Confidential Proposal" emblazoned across the top, followed by detailed text, professional renderings, and financial projections. The basics were as expected. Miller proposed to purchase Eli's rights to the cabin and surrounding 5 acres at a price that made Eli blink twice to confirm he'd read it correctly. The amount represented more money than he had earned in his entire working life, enough to purchase a substantial property outright anywhere in the county. More surprising were the additional terms. Miller wasn't simply buying him out. He was proposing a partnership of sorts, Mountain Heritage Living, a development that would create 20 authentic homesteads across the adjacent 50 acres, each built using the principles and techniques Eli had employed. The cabins would be sold as vacation properties or retirement homes for wealthy clients seeking an authentic, sustainable mountain experience. Eli's role would be consultant and resident expert, teaching workshops, overseeing construction details, ensuring the development maintained the authenticity that made his own place special. His cabin would serve as the model home and educational center. He would receive not just the purchase price, but ongoing compensation as the development's philosophical cornerstone. The final pages included architectural renderings, tasteful cabins reminiscent of his own, arranged thoughtfully across the landscape, each with gardens, solar panels, and water collection systems. A small central gathering area featured a building labeled Thompson Heritage Center. It was, objectively, an impressive and generous proposal. Miller had clearly recognized the potential in what Eli had created and was offering both substantial compensation and ongoing recognition. The development itself appeared environmentally conscious, designed to minimize impact while providing access to the lifestyle Eli had pioneered. Yet something about it created a heaviness in Eli's chest as he carefully returned the papers to their envelope. The proposal represented a fundamental translation. from relationship with land to real estate product, from personal journey to marketable concept, from home to development. He placed the envelope under the paperweight again and stepped outside. The night air carried autumn's first real chill, the stars extraordinarily clear above the mountain ridge. From the porch, he could see the outlines of his creation in the moonlight, the carefully terraced gardens, the fruit trees finally reaching productive maturity, the spring-fed pond reflecting starlight, the cabin itself solid and welcoming, with lamplight glowing through windows he had rebuilt by hand. Miller had made an offer for all of this. But what Eli had to decide was whether what mattered most could be bought at any price. The pocket watch rested in Eli's palm, its worn silver case warmed by his touch. It had belonged to his father, and before that to his grandfather, a Thompson family heirloom passed down through generations of men who had measured their days by honest work rather than material wealth. The timepiece no longer kept perfect hours. Its mechanism occasionally hesitated, requiring a gentle tap to continue its steady rhythm. But its imperfect timekeeping seemed appropriate for moments like this, when decisions required contemplation beyond the rigid march of minutes. 3 days had passed since Miller's proposal arrived. 3 days of walking the property in expanding circles, retracing the journey from dilapidated cabin to thriving homestead. 3 days of conversations, with Martha, with William Hatcher, with James, with himself. 3 days of measuring the offer's substantial financial weight against less tangible but perhaps more significant values. Eli opened the watch's case, revealing the yellowed face with its delicate hands and faded numerals. Inside the lid, nearly worn smooth by time and handling, was an inscription his grandfather had added. Worth measured in moments, not money. The evening stretched quietly around him as he sat on the porch, the watch in one hand and his journal in the other. He had spent the afternoon reviewing his records, not just the practical documentation of crops and projects, but the emotional journey recorded in entries that spanned nearly 2 years. The early pages captured his initial struggles, the roof that leaked despite repeated repairs, the garden soil that required months of amendment before yielding reluctantly, the loneliness of winter evenings when snowdrifts made travel impossible. Those entries contained doubt, exhaustion, and moments of wondering whether the skeptics had been right. Middle sections chronicled gradual progress, successful harvests, structural improvements, the slowly growing web of community connections. The writing here showed growing confidence, deepening commitment, occasional pride in problems solved through ingenuity rather than purchased solutions. Most recent entries reflected a transition from mere survival to genuine thriving, both for the land and for Eli himself. The property had begun to respond generously to his care, offering abundance beyond immediate needs. His own skills had expanded from basic competence to craftsmanship, from tentative experiments to confident innovations. Throughout the journal ran a theme unrelated to practical accomplishments, a growing sense of belonging, of brightness, of having found his place in the world's order. This intangible outcome, this rootedness, had never been an explicit goal of the project, yet had emerged as perhaps its most significant achievement. Miller's offer addressed the tangible aspects of what Eli had created. The financial terms were more than fair. The proposed partnership acknowledged his expertise and vision. The development itself, as designed, would be relatively low impact and might even preserve more of the mountain's character than the inevitable alternatives if Miller sold to less conscientious developers. Yet, the pocket watch in his hand seemed to ask questions. The proposal didn't answer. What happens to a place when its fundamental purpose shifts from home to commodity? Can a relationship with land be replicated 20 times across adjacent acres without losing its essential character? Does sharing a vision necessarily mean marketing it? From inside the cabin, Eli could see his father's hammer hanging above the workbench. The old cornerstone with its 1887 inscription displayed on a shelf. The quilt from Martha folded carefully at the foot of his bed. These objects embodied connections that transcended monetary value, links to the past, to community, to something more enduring than market transactions. As twilight deepened into true evening, Eli made his final entry in the journal, recording not just his decision, but the path that led to it. The writing came slowly, each word considered carefully, the passage punctuated by long moments of simply sitting with the watch's weight in his hand, feeling its connection to generations who had faced their own pivotal choices. When he finished writing, Eli closed the journal and returned the watch to its wooden box on the mantel. His decisions settled around him like a mantle, not without weight, but perfectly fitted to his shoulders. Tomorrow he would compose his response to Miller. Tonight, he would simply be present in the home he had created, listening to the cricket songs rising from the meadow, the gentle turning of the water wheel in the darkness, the occasional call of a barred owl from the forest edge. These sounds formed a kind of music, not the structured harmony of composed pieces, but the authentic chorus of a living place. Whatever happened next, this moment of clarity and connection would remain with him, a reference point for measuring all future choices. Outside, clouds parted to reveal the waxing moon, casting the homestead in silver light. The cabin, once Thompson's Folly, now simply home, stood solid against the night sky, neither defiant nor boastful, simply present and authentic. Like its rebuilder, it had found its proper place in the order of things. The decision was made. All that remained was to give it voice. The deed lay between them on Miller's polished mahogany desk, its official stamps and legal language contrasting with the simple clarity of Eli's handwritten letter beside it. Neither man had touched either document since Eli placed them there 10 minutes earlier. The silence in the wood-paneled office had stretched from awkward to contemplative as Miller processed what Eli had just proposed. "Let me make sure I understand," Miller finally said, leaning forward slightly. "You're declining my offer to purchase the cabin and land." "Yes," Eli replied simply, "despite the substantial financial benefit it would provide. Yes, and instead, you're proposing," Miller gestured toward the deed. "A conservation easement," Eli confirmed. "For both my 5 acres and the adjacent 50, you mentioned developing." Miller's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed genuine surprise. "Explain your thinking." Eli had prepared for this moment during the week since receiving Miller's proposal. He'd consulted Martha, who had connections with a regional land trust. He'd spoken with the county extension agent about similar arrangements elsewhere. He'd even visited a lawyer in the neighboring town to understand the legal implications. The easement would restrict development on the entire 55 acres permanently, he explained. The land would remain in your ownership, but with legally binding limitations on its use. No subdivision, no commercial development beyond small-scale, sustainable agriculture and educational programs. "And what would you gain from this arrangement?" Miller asked, his business mind clearly searching for Eli's angle. "I'd continue as your tenant on the original 5 acres, with a long-term lease at current rates. I'd maintain the right to make improvements consistent with the easement's sustainable use provisions. And nothing else," Eli said, "except the knowledge that the land will remain as it is, regardless of who owns it in the future." Miller leaned back in his chair, studying Eli with new intensity. "You understand what you're refusing? The offer I made represents significant capital, enough to purchase comparable property outright, without restrictions or rent." "I understand the numbers," Eli acknowledged. "But this isn't about equivalent value elsewhere. It's about this specific place, its character and potential, which I propose to preserve through thoughtful development," Miller countered. 20 homesteads designed with the same principles you've employed, maintaining most of the natural landscape. 20 vacation properties," Eli corrected gently, "used occasionally by people with no permanent connection to the mountain." However well designed, they'd fundamentally change what makes this land special. Miller's gaze shifted to the window behind Eli, where his larger holdings were visible across the valley. Neat developments of upscale homes, a golf course, areas being cleared for future construction. His expression revealed a man accustomed to seeing land primarily as investment opportunity, struggling to comprehend a completely different valuation system. The easement would significantly reduce the property's market value, he noted. Both present and future. In purely financial terms, yes, Eli agreed. But I believe it would preserve other kinds of value that can't be measured in dollars. Ecological integrity, agricultural heritage, a working example of sustainable stewardship. For several minutes, Miller said nothing. He picked up the deed, examining its provisions with the practiced eye of someone who had reviewed countless property documents. His finger traced the section detailing permitted and prohibited activities, lingering on language about educational use, the provision allowing for guided tours, workshops and educational programs, he said finally. That was deliberate? Yes, what I've learned shouldn't be hoarded. People are hungry for this knowledge, how to work with land rather than just extract from it. The easement would allow sharing these approaches while preventing exploitation. Something subtle shifted in Miller's demeanor. Not agreement, precisely, but perhaps recognition of an integrity he hadn't expected. He picked up Eli's letter, rereading sections of the carefully composed explanation for declining his generous offer. You write here about stewarding rather than owning, he said. What exactly does that mean to you? Eli considered his words carefully. That true ownership isn't about legal title or control. It's about responsible relationship. The Carsons who built the original cabin understood that. They lived there for generations without depleting what made it special. And you believe you're continuing their legacy. Trying to, Eli acknowledged. Along with adding what we understand now about sustainability that they couldn't have known, Miller placed the letter down and stood, moving to the window. His silhouette against the afternoon light revealed a man physically fit, but showing the first subtle signs of age, perhaps newly conscious of his own legacy beyond balance sheets and property holdings. This proposal is unexpected, he said finally. I'll need time to consider it with my advisors. Of course, Eli replied, standing to leave. The offer remains open, regardless of your decision about the development. The 5 acres I've been working can be placed under easement independently, if you prefer. As Eli reached the door, Miller spoke again. Thompson. Eli turned to the water wheel. The spring development, the heritage orchards. Miller's tone held genuine curiosity. How did you see what could be there when I saw nothing but worthless hillside? I didn't see what could be there, Eli answered honestly. I saw what was already there, waiting to be recognized. The deed remained on Miller's desk as Eli departed. Its future uncertain, but its message delivered. Some things, once truly seen, change how we value everything else. The sapling stood barely 3 feet tall, its slender trunk supported by a simple stake, its few branches adorned with the bright green leaves of new growth. A mountain silverbell, native to these slopes, but increasingly rare due to habitat loss and disease. Eli and Miller had planted it together that morning in a small ceremony that required few words but conveyed significant meaning. The location they'd chosen, halfway between Eli's cabin and the ridge that marked the property's boundary, offered views of both the cultivated homestead and the wild forest beyond. The silverbell would grow slowly, potentially living for more than a century, its spring blossoms eventually visible from miles away. My grandfather planted trees he knew he'd never sit under, Miller had commented as they patted soil around the sapling's base. The statement revealed both a recognition of continuity beyond a single lifetime and perhaps a hint of regret that he had not previously considered such legacy beyond financial holdings. 6 months had passed since. Eli declined Miller's development proposal and offered the conservation alternative instead. Those months had brought negotiations, legal consultations, occasional friction, and ultimately, an agreement that surprised everyone involved. The easement now protected not just the original 5 acres and adjacent 50, but nearly 300 acres of Miller's mountain holdings. The document, finalized just last week, established the Thompson-Miller Conservation Area, a working demonstration of sustainable mountain agriculture and responsible land stewardship. More surprising was Miller's personal transformation. The man who had initially dismissed the cabin as worthless had become increasingly engaged with its potential as an educational resource. He had visited regularly as the easement took shape, each time asking more perceptive questions, gradually shifting from skepticism to genuine curiosity about Eli's methods and philosophy. The financial arrangements reflected this evolution. Rather than simply continuing as tenant, Eli now held the position of resident director for the conservation area's educational programs. Miller had established a modest endowment to support operations, with a focus on teaching traditional skills and sustainable practices to both local residents and visitors from further afield. People need to see alternatives that work, Miller had explained when proposing the expanded vision. My other developments serve their purpose, but this, he had gestured toward the thriving homestead, this offers something different, something increasingly necessary. After planting the sapling, the two men had walked the property's boundaries, discussing plans for the coming year. The cabin would remain Eli's home, but a new structure would be built nearby using the same traditional methods, a workshop and classroom, space where he could share techniques for everything from timber, framing to heritage seed preservation. Now, as evening approached, Eli sat alone on the porch, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this unexpected destination. His journal lay open beside him, its pages chronicling the progression from Thompson's folly to recognized model of sustainable living. The latest entry recorded not just the tree planting ceremony, but the remarkable exchange that followed. As they had surveyed the conservation area's future, Miller had shared something Eli never expected to hear from the wealthy developer. "I've been measuring success wrong," he had said. The admission clearly difficult for a man accustomed to defining achievement in financial terms. Creating more expensive homes on smaller lots, maximizing return on investment, there's a place for that. But it's not the only metric that matters. Miller had gestured toward the wider landscape, the careful balance Eli had cultivated between wild and managed areas, the zones where human intervention enhanced, rather than diminished, natural processes. This kind of success is harder to quantify but more lasting. "I'm beginning to understand why you couldn't put a price on it," the conversation had continued as they inspected the spring development that now supplied not just Eli's needs, but supported a small wetland area, attracting diverse wildlife. Miller had asked increasingly specific questions about water management and soil building, taking notes with the same attention he once reserved for investment opportunities. As Eli completed his journal entry, he noticed movement along the access road. Martha's truck appeared, followed by James Hatcher's vehicle and several others, community members arriving for the monthly skill-sharing gathering that had become a regular event. Today's focus was traditional food preservation, with Eli demonstrating techniques while others contributed their own knowledge. The visitor's log now contained hundreds of signatures. Local residents, agricultural students, sustainability advocates, curious travelers. What had begun as one person's improbable project had evolved into a community resource and regional model. Eli welcomed the arriving guests, watching as they naturally gravitated toward the outdoor kitchen area he'd built specifically for these gatherings. The conversation quickly turned to the conservation easement news, which had spread throughout the county, with reactions ranging from surprise to celebration. "Never thought I'd see Jacob Miller turn environmentalist," Ed Harmon commented with a chuckle. "Transformation indeed, not environmentalist exactly." Eli corrected thoughtfully. More like expanded perspective, recognizing different forms of value. As twilight settled over the mountain, the gathering continued around the large table Eli had built, the same table that had hosted the harvest celebration where Miller had first glimpsed a different kind of community. Lanterns cast warm light across faces engaged in conversation that wove together past wisdom and future possibilities. In the distance, barely visible in the fading light, the newly planted silver bell stood as quiet testament to a transformation greater than either man had imagined when Eli first knocked on Miller's office door 2 years earlier. A transformation not just of land, but of values, vision, and understanding of true wealth.